It began on an ordinary winter night, the kind of night when small-town life feels safe, familiar, and still. December 20th, 1968, Northern California. The air was sharp with cold. The stars stretched over quiet roads of Benicia and Vallejo, and for two young teenagers, the world still seemed full of promise. Betty Lou Jensen was 17, bright-eyed, soft-spoken, and the kind of girl people remember for her easy smile. She loved art, music, and had plans for college. Her boyfriend, David Faraday, 16, was thoughtful and quiet, with a gentle nature that made him instantly likable. He wanted to become an engineer. They were young, hopeful, and like any other couple, just looking for a moment of peace together. That Friday evening, they drove out to Lake Herman Road, a secluded, lover's lane area that local teens often use to escape the noise of the world. They parked on the roadside, perhaps talking about Christmas or college or their future. They could not have known that their lives were minutes away from ending, and that their deaths would mark the beginning of one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in American history. When police later found them, the scene was chilling in its simplicity, a parked Rambler station wagon. Its passenger door open, headlights still faintly glowing in the dark. David Faraday lay beside the car, a single gunshot wound to the head. Betty Lou Jensen's body was discovered a short distance away. She had tried to run. 5 bullets struck her in the back before she fell to the frozen ground. No signs of robbery. No signs of sexual assault. Just a silent evidence of violence, scattered shell casings, and 2 innocent lives extinguished for no clear reason. The investigators were baffled. There was no witness, no noise, no trace of the killer. Only the echo of gunfire in the night. At first, police suspected a personal motive, maybe jealousy or revenge. But there was nothing to suggest that David or Betty Lou had enemies. Their families were devastated, their community shocked. Benicia was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where something like this simply didn't happen. But the peace that defined those small towns was gone now, replaced by fear and by questions no one could answer. For months, the case remained unsolved. Leads went nowhere. The newspapers reported on it, but it slowly began to fade from headlines. Just another senseless tragedy. Until July 4th, 1969, when another young couple was attacked under eerily similar circumstances in nearby Vallejo. Darlene Farron and Michael Mageau were sitting in a parked car when a man approached with a flashlight and gun. Darlene was killed. Michael survived, barely, and described their attacker as a stocky white male, maybe in his late 20s to early 40s, wearing glasses. Within days, the local newspapers began receiving letters, typed and handwritten notes filled with taunts, threats, and cryptic symbols. The writer claimed responsibility for both attacks and demanded his words be published or more people would die. He included details only the killer could know. And then he signed his letter with a strange symbol, a circle with a cross through it, and a name that would send chills through generations to come. "I am the Zodiac," he wrote. With those words, a faceless murder became something more, a ghost in the California night, a monster who didn't just kill, but demanded to be seen, heard, and feared. The media frenzy began, and the public's terror grew. No one knew when he would strike again, or who he was. His voice, cold and taunting, echoed through his letters. Man is the most dangerous animal of all. And indeed, he proved it. For Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, the first known victims, there would be no justice, no trial, no closure. Their families would live with questions that time could never answer. Who was the man who took their children's lives? Why did he choose them? And what darkness drove him to kill? The Zodiac's reign of terror was only beginning, and his thirst for recognition would soon spill from gunfire to ink, from blood to code. He would write his madness into letters, puzzles, and ciphers, daring the world to find him. But on that cold December night, before the headlines and the fear, before the cryptic symbols and taunting words, there were just 2 teenagers on a quiet road, full of dreams, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. And in an instant, one man's evil ended it all. This was where the Zodiac awoke. And for California, nothing would ever be the same again. By the summer of 1969, Northern California was holding its breath. 2 young couples were dead. Another man had barely survived, and no one could explain who was behind the attacks or why. But before investigators could even piece the puzzle together, the killer made his move. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to be heard. On August 1st, 1969, editors at three Bay Area newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Chronicle, and San Francisco Examiner, each received a letter. The envelopes were neatly addressed, written in blocky, deliberate handwriting. Inside, each was a message that would send shivers through the newsroom. The writer claimed responsibility for the shootings at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. He described the weapons he used, the number of shots fired, and small details that police had kept secret. But what truly caught their attention was what came next, a cryptogram, a puzzle made up of strange symbols and letters arranged in an eerie grid. He demanded that the newspapers publish his ciphers on the front page. If they didn't, he warned, "I will go on a killing rampage Friday night." The demand wasn't a bluff. Police urged the papers to comply, fearing another bloodbath. Within days, the cipher appeared in print, and suddenly, the public became part of the investigation. Amateur code breakers, students, and families across the country tried to make sense of the strange symbols. The code was cracked a week later by a California schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife, Betty. What they found inside wasn't a confession. It was a manifesto of madness. The message read, in part, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." It was a horrifying glimpse into the killer's mind. Someone who saw murder as sport, who believed his crimes gave him power, who thought himself as a hunter and humanity as prey. The cipher ended with a chilling promise. His identity was hidden within the code, but that, he teased, would never be found. The signature he left at the bottom, a circle with a cross, would soon become one of the most feared symbols in American criminal history. It marked not only his letters, but his ownership over his victims, and his control over the public's imagination. Then came another letter, postmarked July 31st. This time, the writer introduced himself formally. "Dear editor," this is the Zodiac speaking. It was the first time he used a name that would come to define him. The Zodiac. A title, a persona, a brand of terror. It wasn't enough for him to take lives. He wanted to build a legend. The letters continued through 1969 and into the 1970s, mocking the police, insulting the public, and keeping the fear alive. He described his victims in vivid detail, sketched diagrams of bomb designs, and even included blood-stained scraps of a taxi driver's shirt after one of his murders. He toyed with investigators as if they were pieces in his own twisted game. Law enforcement scrambled to keep up. Detectives from Vallejo, San Francisco, and Napa County worked together, while the FBI provided cryptographic assistance. But for every clue the Zodiac sent, he buried it under riddles, false leads, and taunts that seemed designed not to reveal, but to control. His messages weren't just about murder. They were about manipulation. He turned the press into his stage and the public into his audience. Every headline, every newspaper front page gave him what he wanted most: attention, fear, power. Experts who studied his letters saw a man with a dual nature. On one hand, methodical and intelligent, capable of crafting complex ciphers and evading capture. On the other, deeply unstable, a narcissist who believed himself superior to law enforcement and society itself. He referred to his victims as slaves who would serve him in the afterlife, suggesting a mind steeped in delusion and grandiosity. He wasn't killing for money or revenge or even simple rage. He was killing for an idea, to prove that he could. Each letter was a performance, each murder an act of control. The Zodiac didn't just want to take lives. He wanted to write a story in blood and ink, to make the world watch and tremble. The public began living in quiet dread. Couples stopped parking along country roads. Strangers eyed each other in cafes and buses. Police hotlines rang constantly with tips and confessions. Hundreds of men were questioned, dozens suspected, and none confirmed. The killer had transformed Northern California into a stage, and everyone else into actors in his play. As 1969 turned to 1970, his letters became darker, more elaborate. He claimed new victims. He sent maps with crosshair symbols marking potential killing zones. He taunted detectives by name, calling them fools and pigs. Every word carried the same message. You can't stop me. And the worst part? He was right. The Zodiac had created a new kind of terror, one not confined to the act of murder itself, but stretched across headlines, across living rooms, across time. He was a phantom who communicated from the shadows, a killer who refused to be forgotten. In his own words, he declared, "I am waiting for a good movie about me. Who will play me, I wonder?" The arrogance was staggering, the cruelty almost gleeful. But behind it all was something colder, a man whose need to be noticed was as insatiable as his need to kill. The letters would continue for years, each one deepening the mystery. And while his handwriting gave investigators fragments of his personality, it revealed nothing of his face. The world now knew his name, the Zodiac, but his identity remained a cipher all its own. By late 1969, the Zodiac wasn't just a murderer, he was a myth. His letters were splashed across front pages, his cryptic crosshair symbol scrawled in black ink that the Bay Area couldn't escape. He had transformed fear into an art form, taunting police, mocking reporters, and writing himself into America's nightmares. But for those tasked with catching him, it was no story. It was a war, one they were losing. Detectives across multiple jurisdictions, Vallejo, Napa County, San Francisco, had begun to realize they were chasing the same man, the same handwriting, the same voice. But that was where the similarities ended. Each killing seemed to evolve, shifting tactics, weapons, even victims. The Zodiac was unpredictable, a shapeshifter whose only constant was cruelty. In San Francisco, Inspector Dave Tashi, a decorated homicide detective known for his sharp instincts and restless drive, joined the case. He was a kind of investigator who carried guilt like a shadow, determined, meticulous, sleepless. Tashi became obsessed, poring over letters, interviewing witnesses, and building walls of notes and photos that grew taller with each passing week. Alongside him was his partner, Inspector Bill Armstrong, calm, methodical, and quietly haunted by what they saw. The investigation quickly became a labyrinth. Every clue pointed in two directions. Every lead seemed to vanish into smoke. Forensic technology was primitive by today's standards. No DNA profiling, no digital databases, no security cameras to trace the killer's movements. All they had were bullets, handwriting samples, and the killer's words. And those words were like quicksand. The Zodiac wrote with calculated madness. His letters were laced with sarcasm, contempt, and an eerie playfulness. He would describe his crimes in detail, then switch tone to discuss his favorite movies or the weather. In one letter, he drew diagrams for bombs he threatened to plant on school buses, boasting that he would pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. Parents were terrified. School routes were altered. Patrol cars escorted buses for months. The Zodiac had turned entire communities into prisoners of fear, and he hadn't even needed to kill again to do it. But behind the scenes, law enforcement refused to give up. Hundreds of suspects were investigated. Tips poured in from all over the country. The FBI provided cryptographic assistance, while local police tried to piece together a pattern. But the Zodiac was always one step ahead. Then came another murder. October 11, 1969. A San Francisco cab driver named Paul Stein picked up a passenger at the intersection of Mason and Geary Streets. His fare was supposed to end at Washington and Maple, but it didn't. The passenger changed the destination last minute. Minutes later, shots were fired. Stein was found slumped over the steering wheel, shot once in the head. At first, police thought it was a robbery. But nothing was taken, not the wallet, not the keys, not the watch. Instead, the killer had taken a trophy, a portion of Stein's bloody shirt. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. Inside was a scrap of that very shirt, proof beyond doubt that the Zodiac had struck again. The letter mocked the police, calling them clueless and promising more murders. He bragged about walking past patrol cars moments after the shooting. And indeed, police had stopped a man matching his general description that night, but let him go, thinking he was just a bystander. The killer had slipped through their fingers. The realization hit the department hard. The city was in panic. Reporters filled the airwaves. Headlines screamed of a killer in disguise, and the sense of safety that San Francisco once had evaporated overnight. The Zodiac wrote again, claiming to have killed dozens more than were publicly known. Some letters were full of threats. Others, strange drawings and taunt about his slaves in paradise. Detectives couldn't tell where the truth ended and the fantasy began. Every time they thought they were closing in, the Zodiac vanished again, into the fog, into the crowd, into the legend he'd built for himself. Tashi and Armstrong worked relentlessly, chasing down handwriting samples, interrogating suspects, studying the killer's phrasing for a hidden meaning. They pored over the ciphers, looking for patterns, trying to step into the mind of a man who seemed to thrive on control. The pressure was immense. The media began questioning the competence of the police. Politicians demanded answers. But the killer had found the perfect weapon. Not the gun, not the knife, but fear itself. He didn't just take lives. He held an entire region hostage with his words. Psychologists who studied his behavior saw in him a man desperate for validation, someone who needed to assert superiority, who enjoyed watching others squirm. He was organized but unhinged, logical but ruled by delusion. A paradox, a ghost with a pen. As weeks turned into months, detectives grew weary but obsessed. Tashi later confessed that the Zodiac never truly left his mind. Even years after the trail went cold, he would wake at night replaying interviews, wondering if he'd missed something. Every suspect that didn't pan out felt like a personal failure. The investigation had consumed them all, and yet, despite thousands of leads, dozens of interviews, and countless theories, the Zodiac remained free. He was always watching, it seemed, reading the papers, responding to coverage, and reminding the world that he was still in control. Every letter that arrived reignited the terror. Every word a reminder that he was out there somewhere, hiding behind a mask of ordinary life. By the early 1970s, the trail began to cool. The killings stopped, at least the confirmed ones. But the letters continued sporadically, sometimes hinting at new victims, sometimes just gloating about old ones. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he went silent. The fear didn't vanish, though. It lingered like smoke, because the Zodiac had achieved what few killers ever could: immortality. He had written himself into history, his identity sealed in mystery, his words still echoing long after his gun went quiet. The hunt had begun with bullets and blood, but by the end, it became something else, a hunt for understanding, for answers that never came. And for detectives like Dave Tashi, it was a chase that would haunt him for the rest of his life. For years after the Zodiac's last confirmed murder, his voice continued to echo, not through new killings, but through the words he had already written, the ciphers, the codes, the letters that had once struck fear into the hearts of millions. They were more than puzzles. They were his fingerprints, the lingering traces of his mind. And they became the obsession of countless detectives, code breakers, and ordinary people who refused to let the mystery rest. When the killings stopped in the early 1970s, the Zodiac didn't vanish entirely. He simply retreated into the shadows, watching as his legend grew. From time to time, new letters appeared in newsrooms, claiming to be from him. Some were dismissed as hoaxes. Others felt too authentic to ignore. But one thing never changed: his handwriting, those chilling phrases, and that cryptic symbol, a circle with a cross through it, all marked with the same cold precision. Of all his writings, one stood apart: the 340 character cipher, known simply as the 340. Sent to the San Francisco Chronicle in November 1969, the cipher was a grid of strange symbols, triangles, circles, letters, and shapes that seemed to form an impossible code. For over 50 years, it remained unsolved, a mocking reminder of the killer's intellect and arrogance. Even the FBI couldn't crack it. The best cryptographers in the country tried, from CIA analysts to private citizens, but every theory led to dead ends. Some said it contained his name. Others believed it was nonsense, an intentional trap designed to humiliate anyone who tried to decipher it. And perhaps that was exactly what the Zodiac wanted. But time has a way of revealing what evil tries to hide. In December 2020, 51 years after the cipher was first published, a small team of codebreakers from around the world achieved what no one else had done. Using modern computing power and decades of cryptographic insight, they finally solved the Z340 cipher. The message they uncovered didn't reveal the Zodiac's name, nor did it bring justice. But what it did reveal was a chilling window into the killer's mind, and the twisted sense of pride that defined him. The decoded message read, in part, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise." It was pure narcissism and pure horror. Even half a century later, the Zodiac was still mocking his pursuers, gloating about his crimes, and reveling in the fear he had caused. The message was devoid of remorse, filled instead with deranged self-importance. He believed that the people he killed were his servants in the afterlife, that death itself was his reward. The code breakers, David Oranchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck, sent their findings to the FBI, who later confirmed that the cipher had been successfully solved. It was a historic moment in criminal cryptography, but one that carried a bitter truth. The killer was likely long gone, and his real name was still unknown. The world watched in awe. For decades, the Zodiac's codes have been a holy grail of true crime, the ultimate unsolved riddle. And now, part of that puzzle had finally yielded its secrets. Yet the victory felt hollow. No arrest followed. No new clues surfaced. The identity that had eluded generations of detectives remained just out of reach. For some, the cipher solution reignited their obsession. Amateur sleuths pored over the text, hoping the killer had left hidden hints within his words. Linguists analyzed his phrasing. Psychologists dissected his tone. What they found was a portrait of a man who craved control, a narcissistic predator who saw himself as untouchable, immortalized through fear. He wanted fame, not anonymity. He wanted to be remembered, not as a monster, but as a mastermind. And in that sense, he succeeded, because the Zodiac had achieved what few killers ever could. He turned his crimes into a legacy. His cipher wasn't just a message. It was a time capsule of terror, a letter to the future from a man who believed he would never die. The 2020 breakthrough was both triumph and tragedy. It reminded the world of the brilliance that evil can sometimes wear as a mask, and of the limits of justice when the trail grows cold. It gave us words but not closure, answers but no peace. Even today, new technologies continue to revisit old evidence, DNA analysis, handwriting comparisons, and digital profiling. And yet, the Zodiac remains just beyond the edge of certainty. Who was he? A factory worker? A school teacher? A neighbor reading the newspaper over breakfast while the world hunted his shadow? The cipher was solved, but the man behind it still hides in plain sight, in archives and theories, in the collective fear he left behind. Because some ghosts don't fade with time. They whisper, even through the silence of decades. And the Zodiac's whisper is louder than ever. For more than half a century, the name Zodiac has lingered like a curse over Northern California, a reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary faces, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are never caught. The murders stopped, but the obsession didn't. Detectives retired, evidence grew old, and families of the victims were left with nothing but grief and questions. But even as decades passed, the world refused to let the Zodiac fade into legend. His crimes were too haunting, his personality too strange, his mystery too complete. Over the years, hundreds of suspects were named, men of every profession, every background, each one examined, interrogated, and then eventually dismissed. But among them, one name has continued to resurface more than any other: Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was a schoolteacher from Vallejo, intelligent, eccentric, and often described by those who knew him as odd. He owned watches marked with the same crosshair, symbol the Zodiac used. He lived near the sites of the first murders. He even told friends he liked the idea of calling himself Zodiac. Police found disturbing items in his home, weapons, notes, and strange writings, but no definitive proof. In 1992, Allen died of a heart attack. DNA tests later failed to link him to the letters. He remained, like so many others, a compelling maybe, a man who might have been a killer, or just another shadow mistaken for one. And still, the mystery endured. Then in 2021, a private group of cold case investigators called the Case Breakers announced they had identified the Zodiac Killer as Gary Francis Post, an Air Force veteran who had died in 2018. They pointed to scars on his forehead, cryptic anagrams hidden in the letters, and alleged connections to unsolved murders in other states. For a moment, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle might have fallen into place. But the FBI was quick to respond. The case, they said, remained open and unsolved. No forensic evidence linked Post to the Zodiac crimes. Law enforcement urged caution. Like every other theory before it, this one began to crumble under the weight of speculation. The truth, once again, slipped away. Each time a new suspect emerges, hope flickers and then fades. Because the Zodiac was more than a man. He was a phantom built on fear, and every time we think we've caught him, he dissolves back into smoke. But while his identity remains hidden, his impact is undeniable. The communities he terrorized were forever changed. In Benicia, Vallejo, Napa, people still remember the fear of those nights, the warnings to stay inside, the police escorts for school buses. Couples who once sat beneath the stars never looked at dark country roads the same way again. Families of the victims still carry the weight of what was stolen. For them, the Zodiac isn't a puzzle to solve or a mystery to debate. He's the reason a child never came home, the reason a holiday dinner forever has an empty chair. Those who survived his attacks live with memories they can't erase. Flashes of headlights, the sound of footsteps, the cold voice of a man who saw them not as human beings, but as trophies in his cruel game. Some have spent their lives trying to move on. Others never stopped searching for his face in the crowd. And yet, despite all the pain, the story of the Zodiac continues to fascinate us. Maybe because he represents something we can't quite understand, the darkness that hides behind ordinary eyes. He was not a monster from myth or legend. He was a man, someone who walked the same streets, read the same newspapers, and blended into the same society he so despised. Psychologists say the Zodiac's true motive was control. Not money, not vengeance, not passion, but power. He wanted to control the narrative, to dictate how the world would remember him. Every letter, every cipher, every mocking taunt was a way of saying, I decide how this story ends. And perhaps, in his own twisted way, he succeeded. Because here we are, 50 years later, still speaking his name. Technology may yet reveal the truth. Forensic genealogy has solved colder cases than this. Somewhere, in the evidence boxes stored in San Francisco's archives, there might be a trace, a fragment of DNA, a hair, a fingerprint too faint for 1970, but clear enough for 2025. Maybe someday soon the silence will break. But until that day, the Zodiac remains both man and myth, a shadow carved into history, a cipher that refuses to yield its final secret. He left behind no confession, no closure, only questions that echo like the sound of gunfire across the bay. Who was he? Why did he kill? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, is it possible he was never caught because he was never truly finished? As the years pass and new generations discover his story, the Zodiac continues to remind us of something deeply unsettling. That evil doesn't always look like a monster in the dark. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor, a stranger on the bus, a man reading the morning paper, smiling at the headlines that bear his name. The Zodiac remains unsolved. His victims unforgettable. His story unfinished. And maybe that's what he wanted all along. So now, we turn the question over to you. Who do you believe the Zodiac really was? What clues do you think we've missed? Share your thoughts, your theories, your reflections in the comments below, because the conversation, like the mystery, still isn't over. And if you want to explore more stories of the darkness that hide behind human faces, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because some secrets, like the Zodiac's, are still waiting to be uncovered.